Hey, what's up, people? Welcome to my review and in depth analysis of Star Wars in the Shadow of Yavin. Originally a 2013 Star Wars comic that was released by Dark Horse Comics. And I have to just say right away that I absolutely adore this series. I knew right away as soon as I read the first 4 pages and saw the amazing artwork that I was going to love this. I felt at home. The images by Carlos de Anda is excellent. The writing by Brian Wood is excellent. I feel right at home as an original trilogy lover. And compare this to something like Star Wars, the Star Wars comic released by Marvel in 2015 that was drawn by John Cassaday. This blows that out the water. I thought that comic was weak. I thought the artwork was boring. I'm not a big fan of John Cassaday. I mean, that comic wasn't awful or offensive. It was just boring. But in comparison, this series and In the Shadow of Yavin, the first volume, it just really engages you. And I thought the pacing was outstanding. It was perfect. And the way that it treated all the characters, it did it with respect. And at the same time, it was exciting. Especially with Princess Leia. Princess Leia in this first volume is a complete and utter badass. And when I actually read this interpretation rather of Princess Leia, it made me feel like, you know what? We really didn't see Leia flex that much in the films, right? But don't worry, she does a lot of good flex in here. And what I mean by that is that she does a lot of great action, a lot of great decision making as far as being a leader. I mean, Princess Leia hops in an X-Wing and just basically saves the day at one point. And when I read that, I was like, wow, I never thought of that. Princess Leia in an X-Wing. She's a senator, she's a princess, and now here she is in an X-Wing saving the day. She be on the front lines fighting. She's amazing. She is amazing in the expanded universe, and this comic did her a great justice. They did her really good. I absolutely loved it. So, without further ado, let's begin this review of In the Shadow of Yavin, the first volume in this amazing Dark Horse comic series. So, it's important to note that this series takes place after episode 4, after the destruction of the first Death Star. So, it turns out at this point in the story that the rebels are looking for a new base in the Outer Rim because obviously after the first film, after episode 4, and after the incident with the first Death Star, the Empire knows where their rebel base is. So they can't be at Yavin no longer. They got to find a new base. Now Luke can't understand how Leia can endure so much loss at this point. Leia has basically lost her entire home planet, everything she's ever known, right? Her family, her friends, just her whole planet. And Luke is sitting there, he's mourning the loss of Ben Kenobi, he's mourning the loss of his aunt and uncle, and then he looks at Leia and he just sees Leia she just keeps going. She keeps going. She hasn't stopped and taken time to mourn the loss of Yavin. And Luke kind of wonders how she can keep going like that. It's impressive as far as being a leader, right? Now, the Empire ultimately finds the rebels, and Leia is gunned down on a planet called Dominus 3. So, initially, the rebels were scouting for locations and they were all in their X-Wings. Leia was in the X-Wing and she's gunned down and there's a bomber inbound, but Leia and the rest of the X-Wings are able to escape using the cover of a polar storm. A polar storm, right? Now, one badass thing about Leia I forgot to mention is that she's able to get the drop on the TIE fighter pilot that gunned her down. So the pilot shoots her down. They both crash land on the planet. And Leia is able to basically kill that dude before he even has a chance to pull out his blaster. And it was a pretty badass maneuver. Now, despite this, one of the flight officers doesn't really respect Leia, and he kind of talks down to her, saying princess instead of commander or whatever at the rendezvous point. And, and she doesn't let it get to her, but it clearly illustrates that there's some people that don't respect her command because she's a princess and they don't really view her as a soldier or a warrior, which I like. I like this setup, right? And I like this opportunity to make Leia look tough, to make her look like a fighter, right? Even though the movies back then, when the first original Star Wars came out, it was mind-blowing to see Leia take charge of her own rescue and all that. But despite that, the only other time we really saw her take command is when she killed Jabba. When she was there on the front lines during the Battle of Endor and all that. But the way she's depicted in this book, I wish I could have seen it in a movie, right? Maybe someday Disney will get their act together and they'll make like an anime feature. And they'll be able to depict Leia as a badass on the front lines fighting or in an X-Wing. But don't get your hopes up. Now, Mon Mothma, at this point, thinks that there is a spy in the Alliance. And as a result of this, she gives Princess Leia full command to assemble her own team to find the spy while simultaneously finding a new base for the rebels. Now, as this is going down, Palpatine is very upset with Darth Vader because of what happened at the end of the first film, A New Hope. That being that the Death Star was destroyed. So he's very disappointed in Darth Vader for the Death Star being destroyed. He looks at Vader like, this is your failure right here. And as a result of this, Palpatine demotes Vader. And he takes away his Star Destroyer. And he replaces his command with an individual named as Colonel Bircher. So Colonel Bircher takes over, and Vader has to prove himself once again to Palpatine if he wants to get his command back, if he wants to get his Star Destroyer back. Now, while this is going down, Boba Fett is after Han Solo. So we're already setting up this bounty hunter going after Han thing that we see in The Empire Strikes Back. Now, Han is able to escape, but notices a Star Destroyer, and he's starting to come to the conclusion that maybe these bounty hunters are working with the Empire, right? He hasn't quite figured it out yet, but he's able to make this minor deduction that that's a possibility. And it is, as we've seen in The Empire Strikes Back. Now, after Han's escape, he decides to go to Coruscant and look for Mon Mothma's contact as a way to get back in touch with the Rebel Alliance. And coming back to Leia, Leia finally admits to herself that she is having difficulty mourning Alderaan. And once again, I really appreciate this character development for Leia. It gives her character a lot more dimension, knowing that all these dynamics are going on within her. Now, after this character moment, Leia finally is able to assemble her special team, which includes Luke Skywalker and some of the best Rebel pilots, Wedge Antilles being one of them. Coming back to Han, he shoots Mon Mothma's contact because he can immediately smell a rat. And I love this, man. This is pure Han Solo right here. No questions asked. He just realizes it. Boom! And blasts that fool. And I thought it was classic Han shoots first kind of moment. It was outstanding. I truly loved it. Now, Luke defies Leia's orders by going a long route to cover his tracks, right? So they're on a mission, Luke and another female pilot that he's getting flirtatious with. They're on a mission, and Luke decides to go back to the rendezvous point using a longer route in order to cover their tracks. Now, as a result of this, Leia is very upset. She's upset about it. She feels like Luke is not following commands, that maybe his win at the Battle of Yavin, the way he destroyed the first Death Star, maybe it's going to his head. And as a result of this, she decides to restrict Luke to his quarters because he needs to follow orders. And she feels like he's being too cocky. Now, this female pilot that Luke is getting flirtatious with, her name is Prithee, and she's also grounded too. Now, an important thing to note with the Rebel Alliance is that they have developed new X-Wing fighters, and these new fighters are better than the TIE fighters that they're going up against. As this is going down, Han and Chewbacca are in a shootout at Coruscant. So they're still trying to get away from the Imperials and these bounty hunters. Now Leia purposely decides to leak false intel in order to possibly isolate the rat that's telling the Imperials of the rebels' whereabouts, their rendezvous points. So what keeps happening is that the Imperials keep on figuring out where the rebels are as they scout for a rebel base. So I kind of forgot to mention that important detail. Every time they scout, go to a new planet that could possibly be appropriate for a new rebel base, the Imperials show up. This is why Mon Mothma and Leia suspects that there's a mole somewhere within the Rebel Alliance. And again, Leia purposely leaks intel in order to isolate this mole that's in their midst. Now, Leia is starting to kind of suspect that maybe Prithee is the one leaking the intel to the Imperials. However, it is inferred that she could be picking on her because she's jealous that Prithee is flirting with Luke. So that's something that she needs to think about, and Mon Mothma kind of points that out to her. Now Han and Chewbacca continue their confrontation, their fight with the Imperials, this time in an epic chase within the Millennium Falcon that leads them to the Coruscant underlevels. We saw some of this in the Star Wars Clone Wars, how deep down in Coruscant there's a whole different underworld, right? A seedy underworld. And I always kind of like to spend time there in the Star Wars galaxy because anything could happen, right? Now, Obi-Wan Kenobi warns Luke of a danger with Leia, right? And somehow Prithee overhears Obi-Wan Kenobi's warning too, therefore totally confirming that she is force sensitive as well. Now, Rebel pilots go to a planet called Pybus, again, to scout for a new base, and once again, they're ambushed by the Empire. Now, Darth Vader wants the Endor Death Star 2 construction crew to work faster. So this kind of like reminds me of the beginning of Return of the Jedi, and he kills an officer for inferring that he is not communicating to Palpatine properly, that completing the construction within this limited time frame is impossible, right? So Darth Vader once again demonstrates his ruthlessness by killing this officer simply for inferring that he may not be communicating to Palpatine properly, that the time constraints are, it just makes it impossible to complete the Death Star 2 construction on time. Now, once Darth Vader kills this officer, he senses a force-sensitive woman in the room, and her name is Bira Saya. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. As you know, I'm terrible with Star Wars names sometimes. Nevertheless, Darth Vader promotes Bira to Moff to oversee the construction of Death Star 2. Now, Vader contemplates Luke's last name, and I thought this was very interesting. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that he's sitting there like Skywalker. He's a Skywalker, so he's trying to correlate the person, the force-sensitive individual that was strong in the force that destroyed the Death Star at the Battle of Yavin, has the same last name as me, or as my former persona, whatever, Skywalker, right? So I thought that was cool, because We never seen anything like that before. Not in the movies, not in the TV shows. And I've never read anything like that in the Legends books. So I thought that was awesome. Now, here is where we get to see some true badass stuff from Leia. We get to see Leia in an X-Wing, and she takes out a Star Destroyer nearly all by herself. And while that's going down, Han is once again hunted by bounty hunters in the underworld of Coruscant. And Perla, who works for the Imperials, wants to help Han Solo for cash, right? And the whole reason why she even proposes this to Han Solo is because everybody recognizes him. As soon as he walks into this bar, like, everybody's looking at him because he's the famous Han Solo. He's the famous smuggler, wanted criminal, wanted bounty. It's like everybody knows who he is. He's that infamous space cowboy. So Perla sees an opportunity to make some cash if she helps Han Solo escape. Now, going back to Prithee, it turns out the reason why she is force sensitive, it's because it's a part of her culture to train and learn how to use the force. However, she actually ends up rejecting this aspect of her culture. Now, going back to Leia, who just basically destroyed a Star Destroyer nearly all by herself, Leia and the rebels escape the Imperials, but Leia is severely injured by a TIE fighter bomb. Now, it turns out that there is no leak, that they're tracking them somehow. And I find similarities here between this comic and The Last Jedi. So if you remember The Last Jedi, somehow the First Order was able to track the Resistance even though they were using hyperspace, right? So this is kind of the same thing right here. Now, Luke eventually comes to aid Leia and the rebels. And again, Leia is severely injured and she's out of the game. She's going to be out of the game for a minute because her injuries are pretty severe. And they basically put her in a bacta tank in order for her to recuperate and to heal her injuries. Now, at the end of this volume, this first volume, Luke and Wedge are promoted by Mon Mothma, and they're going to be sent on a secret mission. And that's how this first volume, In the Shadow of Yavin, ends. And I thought this was an exciting read. The artwork was outstanding. This was pure original trilogy goodness right here. I loved every page. Loved the way every single character was characterized. There was no corny stuff. There was no lame characters. There was no hidden agendas. It was just pure original trilogy Star Wars. And it really just makes me totally nostalgic for the pre-Disney days. I love the Star Wars Dark Horse comics. That was such an outstanding run. Dark Horse, I cannot praise them enough for their work on Star Wars, right? Now that brings us to the end of this review and in-depth analysis, and I got to give this first volume a total A+. I found absolutely nothing wrong with it, and I can't wait to read the second volume in this series. If you enjoyed the review and in-depth analysis, please like, subscribe, and share. May the Force be with you, and last but not least, one love, people. Take care.